Welcome to Talk Lex, a podcast dedicated to common sense discussion of legal issues facing everyday people. Brought to you by Durazio Peterson. For more information, visit duraziopeterson.com. Thanks for listening to Talk Lex. This is Scott Peterson. In the legal profession, words matter. Cases and legacies are often decided based upon the meaning of words. Attorneys like precision when it comes to language. The food industry, on the other hand, is much more ambiguous. Language is used to encourage consumers to buy certain foods, but what that language actually means isn't always clear and is often quite misleading. My guest on this episode is Eric Lovenduski. Eric is the owner of Slate River Farms, a growing family regenerative farm in Greenwich, New York, that he owns with his wife Nellie and runs with some help from his father and his two children. Eric, who's also a full-time geologist, is one of the hardest working people I know. He's a fourth-generation farmer who has taken what he learned as a child and translated it into a modern, sustainable farm. In this episode, we start by talking about the importance of generational planning in family-owned businesses, including farming, and go on to discuss some of the most common misconceptions around the food that we eat and how that impacts us as the consumer. We also talk about the future of farming, the benefits of regenerative farming, and its environmental impact. I really enjoyed this conversation with Eric, and my hope is that this episode provides a bit of clarity for our listeners about the food that we eat and the often misleading language around it. And a quick note about what to expect with Talk Lex moving forward. Each week, we're going to release an episode. Many of these episodes will feature a discussion between Giovanna and I about a current legal topic, but we'll also continue featuring occasional interviews with a wide variety of people who've got interesting perspectives on legal issues that impact many of us. Just a quick request here. If you're enjoying this podcast, we'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe, share it with your friends, and leave us a review. Also, you can find us on Instagram at TalkLexPodcast. And on that note, thanks for listening, and please enjoy my interview with Eric Lovenduski. So Eric, you grew up on a farm. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what that was like and how that farm differed from what you're seeing today and what the farms kind of are today?
So yeah, I grew up in central New York in the Finger Lakes region of New York State, which is a part of New York that is known for large farms, fantastic soil quality, and also beautiful lakes. I'm a fourth generation farmer, but my family is farmed on 4 different farms, which is somewhat unique. Most people have a better process on how they multi-generational their farm. They keep the same property and they just bring new people and new generations in every year. So my grandfather sold his farm that he grew up on, that my father grew up on in New Jersey, and bought the farm in the Finger Lakes in the 70s. And that's where I grew up. And that farm was about 1,200 acres with about another 1,000 acres of rental ground. And it was, say, an average size farm to above average size farm in that part of New York State. We grew mostly just commodity crops. The farming practices that my grandfather and father and uncle kind of evolved with agricultural advancements in the 70s and 80s. So by the time I was in high school, we were down to really just 3 crops: corn, soybeans, and some wheat. And the reason that happened for us was it was a way that 2 people could run the farm without any hired labor. So that farm it wasn't something that I wanted to continue, but I knew I wanted to continue farming in some way. And then in 2014, there was a farming accident, and my uncle was actually killed on the farm, which prompted a sale of that farm. And my father didn't want to stop farming, and I wanted to be engaged in the family tradition and be engaged in agriculture. So we purchased this property out in Greenwich and moved all the farm equipment and everything from back home out here. And we just sort of sat out here for about a year, just looking at things and trying to figure out how we were going to run this new piece of property that we bought. And what we decided was that we wanted to run an operation that was more sustainable in the long term. And we didn't really know what that meant initially, but we knew that it couldn't just be part of the big ag system. So in 2017, we bought 2 cows and 2 calves and started grazing animals in the pastures. And that's grown over the last few years to now we have about 30 cows, and we've expanded into chickens and pigs and egg-laying hens. So the spirit of the operation is we want to create a space that is in tune with nature, is a space that we want to work in, and also a farm that is going to be sustainable in the long run. So that's where we are. Our labor force is small because it's my father and myself and Nellie, my wife, and our two kids. But running animals on a regenerative farm like we have is very labor intensive. It reduces the amount of other inputs that we need, like fertilizer and tractors and things like that are very expensive and costly on the environment. But it's a heavy lift for us to handle. Now, you mentioned farmers are hardworking, and it's interesting because for the longest time, a farm could survive if the farmer just worked hard enough. And over the last generation or so, that isn't really the case anymore. You need more than just grit and a cast iron will to keep an operation going. So we're busy out here, but it's a labor of love.
Well, yeah, you bring up a good point. A lot of what we see and do in our practice involves generational planning and transition and making sure that families and businesses are thinking about what happens from one generation to the next. And I suspect that back in the older days, in earlier generations, there was less focus on thinking about a plan for what's this going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years, let alone beyond that. What's your experience in that? When you came up, was there ever discussion about what are subsequent generations going to do? Was there an expectation? And has that changed at all? Or is it still the kind of thing where you're sort of operating on with some sense of a plan, but not really an idea of what it looks like down the road?
The farmer friends that I grew up with, that their families were committed to the farms surviving and advancing and being nimble, adapting to what the current market is, and also taking some careful risks. Those families, their farms are still in business as family farms and doing well. It's the ones like I grew up on that either didn't have any plans for succession or didn't want succession. So we were in this scenario. We were half of the family wanted succession, but the other half of the family didn't. So that sort of resulted in this we can't have we can't take on another generation into this operation because, and I don't know how this is done in other family businesses, but in farming, generally, the way succession works is if the outgoing generation doesn't get paid the full value of their equity in the business by the incoming generation. And the farms that have been committed to that, the outgoing generation gets taken care of by maybe a salary or having a house and the kids are there to take care of them. They don't get the big payday from selling all the equipment and selling the land and then retiring to a comfy armchair somewhere. So that's a huge thing with succession with farms is what you're talking about, is the succession planning. And there's some families that won't even talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of reaffirms the need to think about those kind of things in advance. And you're not alone in the farming business. I mean, we see it in law practices, dental practices, any businesses where there's these multi-generational operations, and inevitably some of the kids aren't on board with.
It's a stressful thing to talk about, right?
It is, and nobody ever wants to talk about it. But it's a scenario where, God forbid, something happens like what happened in your family situation, and you can run into that as being a big problem, a big area of concern. Out of curiosity, what's the current state of your two kids? Are they going to continue the family tradition, or do you think they're on their way to different things?
I don't know. At this point, if I were a betting man, I'd say it'll probably sunset with me. So my kids, for them, my perspective is that when I was their age, 15 and 13, I didn't want to have anything to do with the farm. It was too much work. You could never go on vacation. There's not a lot of money to be made. And I didn't want to have anything to do with it. But there's a strategy that a lot of farmers take is let the kids go out and just do what they want to do. Kind of like the Amish do with their Rumspringa or whatever that's called. And at some point, they may come back and want to engage in it. And that's one of my motivations, one of Nellie's motivations is to, if they do want to have a farm, to run, we want this to be there for them.
I think that's something that, as someone who owns a family business now, I see a very similar scenario playing out with my kids, where what we do is boring and not exciting to them, and they want to go, God only knows at this point, go ski in Colorado for 2 years or whatever.
Sure, yeah, you can get paid for that, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I think that the philosophy of letting them go back and maybe they come home at some point, that's always an option. And we have the same philosophy about, we want to have something there for them. And let's shift gears for a second. So in our world, in the legal world, language is important, right? And cases are won and lost by specific words. You and I we've worked out together many times over the year. We're both really into health and fitness and nutrition. And so I'm a consumer, and I'm someone who generally likes to be conscious of the food that I'm eating. And before I was lucky enough to have you guys come along where I can get quality stuff, I was like everyone else who's trying to be thoughtful about the food that I eat. And I would go to the store and I would see all these designations on food. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about those, because we're talking about legal issues, but when you're talking about legal issues, there's also regulations and rules. And in the food world, it seems to me that some of the rules and the wording and the language around food is in a gray area at best. So I go to the store and I want to buy some organic meat. What does that mean? And what does that mean to you as a farmer?
Well, if it's got the USDA organic label on it, then it's met the minimum standards for USDA organic, which is, as you know, I'm sure, is a little bit of there's rules and regulations that go along with that. That there are certain pesticides that they're not allowed to use, and there's certain ethical treatment rules, but they're all really, really loose, and they're written in a way that allows the big farms to sort of keep doing what they were doing before, with some minor tweaks to fit the new rules. I always get suspicious of food labels, particularly ones that you can't back up with things. You see things on food labels like all natural, or humane, or no antibiotics, or cage-free for eggs. And many of those things that are on the label are claims that there's no way you can validate those claims. There's no way that there's no body that's overseeing them. Organic is one that certainly is overseen, and there's strict rules about it, but the rules aren't as touchy-feely as you would think they would be.
So if you want to designate something organic, is somebody overseeing? Are they physically coming to look at what you're producing, or is it like a self attestation that my food is organic, and you're allowing that someone could come and do an inspection at some point? How does that work?
The organic rules do include an audit. I believe it's an annual audit of your facility. I don't know if they go through all of the records of what you've bought. And I mean, the other thing is there's a lot of farms that are sort of two-faced, where they have a USDA organic side to them, and then they also have the regular conventional side. So you could easily see how things could get manipulated. Not that I'm suggesting that all organic is just a ball of hooey, but it gets down to, if you don't know the farmer and trust the farmer, then the rule doesn't really mean anything, because there's a lot of room for tomfoolery inside of that label.
Yeah, and so organic might not even have been the best example, because that is actually, from what I understand from the way you're describing it, that's probably it sounds like the most sort of firm or well established of the language. I'm thinking you go to the store and you see grass-fed beef, or free-range chicken, or free-range eggs, or, as you said, antibiotic-free or hormone-free. But is there any regulation whatsoever over you as someone who produces these types of products?
Many of them have no oversight, and no there's no rules around what the claims mean. And there are some, like, there's one, I believe it's the American Grass-Fed Association, and they verify that the beef has been grass-fed, but they don't have an audit. So they collect the fee from the farmer, and the farmer self-certifies that, this is what I do, and yada, 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 with the cows. But there's no third party that comes out to inspect the farm and, look at the feed pile and document what's going on. The other thing about organic that, just before we move too far on from that, one of the things that always baffles me about organic is that is fertilizer. So fertilizer, anyone who has a garden, that if you need to amend the soil to keep the soil healthy, because if you're growing a bunch of, say tomatoes, every year those tomatoes are taking stuff out of the ground, and you need to put bone meal or fish fertilizer or something in the soil. So organic will not allow for chemical fertilizers like chemical-based nitrogen and things like that. So how do they get their fertilizer? Well, there's the main way that the organic farms get their fertilizer is from conventional manure lagoons. So the big conventional farms have their animals all concentrated under one roof, and all that manure just pools up and goes out the back door into a giant pond that they call a lagoon, and it's liquid, and that gets pumped and sprayed on the fields as fertilizer. And it's a super nutrient-rich fertilizer. So that's allowed. Conventional manure is allowed in organic farming. And the other thing that's interesting is, you talk to dairy farmers and they say, what goes into the manure lagoon? And it's everything. Everything goes in the manure lagoon. If you, not that people are like intentionally dumping things down the lagoon, but so that's the biggest sort of red flag for me with USDA organic is that the main source of nutrients for the crop is conventional fertilizer. And they have to do that because it's just, I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago about how fertilizer has to come from somewhere, and the most efficient and the most effective way to get fertilizer is from animals. If not, you're manufacturing it in a chemical plant or mining it out of the ground, which is a non-renewable resource. So they had to allow for that, for the organic rules to pass and for it to get as big as it is now.
But in the idea of you are what you eat, if we're eating products that are labeled as organic, but are being fed from food which is not coming from anywhere near organic, then by extension we aren't really eating anything that's organic. Isn't that kind of
I think you just drew the
Yeah, and so does the same hold true with something like grass-fed beef? I mean, is it if you're buying beef because you think that it's got this grass-fed profile, and maybe we should maybe we'll stop there and you can explain the difference between grass-fed versus grain-fed when it comes to meat, because grass-fed beef is obviously becoming a much more prevalent thing on the market. So what's the difference between the two?
Well, the main difference is how it's raised. All beef is grass-fed for probably 80% of its life. So cows are born on a pasture somewhere, and they spend the first 9-10 months just grazing around the pasture, gaining weight on grass. And then when they reach almost maturity, say maybe 1,000 pounds, and I don't know what the weight is that they round them up, but they round up these yearling calves. And then from there, they go to a feedlot where they're very scientifically fed rations to fatten them up, to take them from, say 1,000 pounds up to 12 or 1,300 pounds as quickly as possible. And that's where the marbling of the steaks and things like that really happen, is in the feedlot. And those feedlots are, there's some pretty rough places. With grass-fed, that they never go to the feedlot. The idea is that they stay on the farm and they eat pasture grasses, and in the wintertime, if grass isn't available, they eat hay. And it takes longer to raise a grass-fed cow than it does a grain-fed. For us, we're around 18 or 20 months in that ballpark, which is on the better side of average. There's some that are 30 months or so, and it starts getting really expensive to keep a cow around for that long. As far as like health-wise goes, people eat for a few different reasons. Like the main reason people eat is just because we have to. But then you get into all these like nuanced reasons of like, there's health, there's, cultural or ethical or cultural or family reasons. There's, the environment, and then there's ethical reasons, and under ethical reasons, you can have like the animal welfare, the workers, how the workers are being treated. So when you start to say like, what are the benefits of grass-fed beef versus grain-fed? There's a lot of them. From health-wise, the health panel of a grass-fed from grass-fed beef is much more nutrient dense. I'm going to be transparent, as much as transparent as I know, because this is as much as I know about it. It's not ridiculously healthier than grain-fed beef, but it certainly is healthier. The rubber really hits the road with grass-fed versus grain-fed when you look at the environmental and the ethical impact of that practice is really, so it's sort of like taking everything into account in the selection of the grass-fed beef over the grain-fed. Most people would probably say, well, grain-fed tastes better, it's more tender, and in some cases that would be true because there's more control on how grain-fed beef is raised. Grass-fed, there's a wide spectrum of, there's farms that are, just sort of, eyeballing and, seeing if the animal looks like it's ready to go off to the slaughterhouse and not really putting a lot of thought into how they're raising it. And then there's farms that we're striving to be, which is folks that are really calculated, moving their animals through the pastures to make sure that they're getting the optimal amount of grasses in at all times, and they're also working to sequester carbon. We raise grass-fed beef here. One of the things we're most proud of is the environmental impact that we have.
You read a great newsletter about some of the things that we're discussing here and about the impact of what you do. And one of the topics that I really enjoyed reading about was the conversation you had about, sort of what the world would look like if everyone stopped eating meat. And as we're recording this in, March of 2021, there's this huge movement towards these plant-based alternatives. So Beyond Meat and various other products that obviously have a future in some capacity. But your perspective on it is an interesting one, given what you do. So what would that world look like from an environmental perspective, and what benefits are there for continuing to raise up farms like yours that are, allowing the sort of production that yours is?
Well, I love talking about, what would happen if we all woke up tomorrow morning and decided to be a vegetarian, and if everybody sort of played along with that, where it would go. And the reality is we'd have to deal with all the animals and stuff like that, but just pretend that's, we just figure that out. And over time, like we were talking about, we would run out of fertility in the soil if we weren't using chemical fertilizers to replace what the plants take away. The other thing is, half of the soil that's in the United States that's available for farming isn't suitable for crops. Half of it. So half of the farmland in the United States is pasture ground.
Is that, when you say pasture ground, what do you mean?
So it's either too hilly or too wet or too rugged to drive a tractor and a corn planter over. So that ground would essentially be useless in this vegan world, because if we weren't using ruminant animals in particular to keep the ground maintained, that would just overgrow. And maybe some people would be fine with that. But we would be reliant on these big seed and chemical companies to support our food system. You know, the Monsantos of the world and Dow Chemical that, you know, that like vegetarians aren't just like eating kale. You know, like that, I'm sure there are some that, and I know there are some friends with some vegetarians that take their diet very seriously. But the reality is there's a lot of processed foods, heavily processed foods that are, you know, vegan friendly or whatever. So we would end up eating a lot more processed foods. These meat alternatives that are, I mean, one of the reasons why we're seeing it so much is because they're cheap to make. You know, they say they're made with, it's interesting, they say they're made with pea protein. Some of them are made with soybeans, some are made with peas. But when they say pea, they don't really mean like the green pea that, you know, you eat in your fettuccine Alfredo. The manipulation, just that it is brilliant, right? To say, oh, it's pea protein.
Well, I mean, that goes to the conversation that we were having earlier, which is, you know, like I said, I mean, we have literally won and occasionally lost cases where over language, right? And specific terms and contracts are won and lost all the time. And so there's this grayness to the whole thing that, you know, I mean, it's funny you say pea protein because I actually just literally had a shake today after my workout that had pea protein in it. and I was actually picturing like, you know, green peas that you get and that I make in pasta or something.
Maybe that's what was in that protein.
I mean, I'm not so confident anymore. So, you know, you were talking, and I may have sidetracked it a little bit about overall environmental benefit to this type of grazing that you guys do at your farm, and you're not alone in it, obviously. Talk about that, and maybe you talk about that in the context of what you like to call, and I know you don't like labels, but what you like to call rotational grazing, regenerative farming, which is another hot topic of the day.
When I think about it, sometimes like we used to work out together. Hopefully, sometime we'll be able to again. But like taking care of your body. If you don't take care of your body, you know, you're just going to get maligned with all sorts of diseases. But if you go to the gym and you don't really have a plan, but you go to the gym and you sort of flail around and wander around in the gym and you're consistent with it, you'll get sort of in shape, you know, a little bit. But if you go to the gym with a plan, a long-term plan, say, this is like my plan over the next couple of years of how I'm going to get to, you know, do this pull-up or do whatever. You're going to have a program that you're going to stick to. And over time, you're going to really reach your maximum. And we look at our pastures sort of the same way. If we didn't graze any animals, our pastures would grow up with brush and brambles and they'd be worthless. And what a lot of people do is they just sort of turn their cows out into the pasture and just let them roam around, and they eat where they want to eat. And the pasture stays sort of maintained, but it's, you know, some areas are a little overgrazed and some areas are undergrazed, but it's not hitting its potential. What we're trying to do is that long-term plan where we want to reach our pastures to reach their optimal. So by doing that, we're going to allow our cows to graze only on a very small portion of the pasture and move them out of there quickly. So multiple times a day, sometimes we'll move our cows into new areas of the pasture. And what that does is, one, cows will eat, they're like kids, they'll eat dessert first if given the option. So they're going to go to the areas that have the best stuff. And then they're going to avoid the areas that aren't as good. So if we concentrate them in a small area, they'll end up eating almost everything. And then they'll also, because there's a lot of density of the animals, they'll trample a lot. And that trampling is critical because the trampling smashes the grass, the plants down, and those plants will start to decay. And also when they're in there, they're pooping, they're peeing, so they're spreading their manure. Then later on in the day, it's time to move the cows. We move them. They see us coming. They know what's going to happen. So they get excited to move. they're going to eat again. So we're kind of driving the progress of the cows' gains by moving them, getting them into a new area. They want to check stuff out. They want to eat. And then that area that they were just in gets a rest. It might get 2 months or more of a rest before the cows get back to that area. So it gets intense work and then a rest period so it can recover and be ready to go the next time. So that cycle is spreading their manure, is not concentrating the manure in one spot. It's trampling the underbrush and turning that into new soil. So that's where the regeneration comes from, that we're actually building the soil on the farm versus just sort of aimlessly letting the cows wander around.
What would be the alternative if you weren't going to rotate? Would you allow the cows to just graze on one field or haphazardly? What would that do to the ground, and what would that do for the environmental piece of this?
Well, what it would do is in a pasture scenario, the cows would eat all the good stuff right away. They'd browse over the whole, say it's a 50-acre pasture. They would browse over the whole thing and they would eat it all down. And then the things like goldenrod and even thistle, spiky stuff, they won't eat that once it gets tall. They'll eat it when it's short. But those plants, those undesirable plants, they'll proliferate. And the good grasses they'll keep getting eaten and eaten. They'll take more and more bites off of it until they're eating the roots. And then when the soil doesn't have the root mass in it, the soil becomes very susceptible to erosion and also compaction from the cows constantly walking over the same areas all the time. And that compaction reduces the potential for organic material in the soil. It also reduces the amount of water holding capacity. So by moving the cows and creating this lush pasture, it leaves behind a sponge for carbon, for rainfall. So all that rainfall isn't just running into the ditch and getting down into the rivers and streams. A cow's footprint will hold some water behind in soft soil. From the grazer's perspective, if we're trying to raise meat, we can graze more cows on the same number of acres if we're doing it in this manner. So there's a benefit to us as the folks who are trying to sell the beef off of these pastures that we can raise more cows per acre if we're moving them around. But like getting back to the very beginning, it takes a lot of labor to go and move the cows and water. I mean, a cow will drink 25 gallons of water a day. So it's just it all gets back to these inputs of labor and time, and how much are we willing to put into it?
You identified, I think, 3 or 4 reasons earlier why buying grass-fed makes a difference, right? And health is one of them, but it may not be the most important one. These other issues that you talked about might actually be much more critical to sort of the long-term benefits to society. But how do you explain it for somebody who says, we can't do this at scale? Can we do this for everyone? Can everyone eat grass-fed, small farm raised beef? Is that a realistic possibility? Or is it never going to be the case that, you can get a McDonald's grass-fed hamburger for 99 cents or whatever it is? What's
probably be imported from New Zealand or something.
Yeah.
I think if you went back into the 1960s and told my father, a teenager growing up on a farm in New Jersey, that, hey, you and your brother, by the time you're in your early 60s, are going to be able to farm 2,000 acres, just the two of you, he would have told you you're crazy. And that's what they did. They did that. So one of the reasons that happened was because of technological advancements, mechanical advancements, and also, I would argue, the ignorance of the environment and food worker rights. You talk about COVID in the slaughtering plants, like half the people in these slaughter facilities got COVID because they work They work like piranhas on animal carcasses. So I think that it's possible, but what I would like to see is the university level research of how to advance the efficiency of the methods of the types of farming that we do to make it easier without sacrificing the environment and the animal welfare. And so if you give a group of engineers a problem and you say, okay, you got to stay within these bounds, over time, they'll figure out how to do it. But our type of farming does not get university funded research like corn and soybean and dairy. It just doesn't happen. Most of the advancements that we use for we wouldn't be able to rotational graze without advanced electric fencing. There's no way it would be possible. But these are things that came out of Australia and New Zealand. We're not doing that research here in the United States. So I think that's one way that it could advance.
What's the reason that it's coming out of New Zealand and Australia? Do they put more of an emphasis on beef and the US just emphasizes soy and corn and if so, what's the reason for that? Is it a product of the numbers and the lobbying and the Monsantos of the world, or what's the...
I don't know exactly why. I mean, New Zealand is known and has been known for grass-fed meat for a long time. There's parts of South America that in the same boat. Argentina, known for grass-fed, and there's a lot of research coming out of there. And I don't know what the political climate is down there as to why that's happened. I'm pretty sure up here in the United States, we don't do it because these big companies like, the American Soybean Growers Association have, they want their research done. And the other thing is, John Deere doesn't stand to make much off of rotational grazing.
Where do you see the future headed in terms of the ability to scale regenerative and rotational farms based on increasing technology?
We're never going to make water easier to get to animals. The fencing and water are some of the biggest hurdles with grazing animals. I think there's probably some advancements that could be made in how water systems work. I think fencing, for sure. There's things that could happen, and we don't, as farmers, we don't have time to do that. I tell my kids all the time, like, if you want to go, you want to research this and get your PhD as an ag researcher, there's probably an opportunity for it at some point, because like you said before, we're not the only ones doing this. There's more and more people entering into this type of farming all the time. So I think it's only going to grow. The other side of things, the big farms are still going to get bigger, and we'll have more mechanization and more automation, which will just drive more and more small farms out of the farming business. Which for me, as a small farmer who we would like to grow and acquire some more land, it's very difficult to buy the neighbor's 200 or 300 acre parcel of ground when we're competing against the dairy farmer down the road that is already farming 8,000 acres that can not easily, but more easily than us, cost justify that purchase. So they can drive the price of ground up.
There are a lot of negatives associated with beef and animal production. We're talking about, labor standards, animal cruelty, and the environmental impact. Are those issues essentially non-existent in the small farm world, or are they improved by doing things the way that you do them? What are the big differences, and how are you guys doing things in a way that eliminates a lot of those concerns from people's minds?
Well, I don't know if it's absent totally in small farms. There's plenty of small farms out there that are probably mistreat their animals just as, and there's plenty of big farms out there that go to great lengths to take care of their animals. But generally speaking, the animals that are in the big system don't have it as nature would have intended it for them. for us, we take the care and the health of our animals probably. We probably put too much emphasis on it. It's probably one of the things that people would look at our business and say, "What are you guys doing?" But you decide to do things, and this is something that we decided to do. That if we're going to raise animals and we're going to kill them and eat them and sell them to our customers, that we want to know that we've done everything that we can to make sure that animal had the life that nature intended it to have. So for us, especially Nellie, she really had to take stock of it for the first, year or so. It's like, can we really do this?
Yeah, I mean that's a reasonable, I think, thing to think about, and it seems that at a large scale, you're operating in a completely different world, and your business does not have concern over the ethics of it, I would assume. But you mentioned some large farms are doing it right, but how? This goes back to what I said right out of the gate, which is, again, like in our world, things are, their language is clear, or it should be. How is a consumer supposed to know who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong? And I'll use it as an example. And I'm not going to ask you to point fingers at anyone directly, but Pete and Jerry's eggs, right? There's a label that I see at the grocery store that I think, oh, well, this has the right words on it, and to me, this looks like something, or to an average consumer, this looks like something that's healthy and done right. I don't know if it is or it isn't, but what advice or suggestions do you have for the average person looking to get their meat from a source that's not abusing its labor, not abusing its animals, and doing things the right way?
It's a time commitment. It really is, because as a civilization, we're so disconnected from the farm. At this point, most people are 2 generations away from having a farm in their family. So, how do you know? It's hard. It is. And if you're one to take on the task of really digging into it, you'll be able to figure it out. I mean, if you look at that Pete and Jerry's egg carton and you see, all right, it's certified humane. What does that mean? Look up that label and see what do they allow? What do they not allow? I'm pretty sure Pete and Jerry's allows debeaking their hens through their certified humane ruling. And some people are okay with that. Some people aren't. We wouldn't be. So it's a time commitment, and a lot of people just throw up their hands and say, "Screw it." It's just I'm gonna buy the thing that I think is I can't spend so much time thinking about this. I got to pick my kids up from dance class. I've got to I'm just going to buy the thing, and the food companies take advantage of that.
And are you seeing any movement or on the part of the smaller farms or the farms that are doing it right to try to change the narrative on this, or to try to make it easier for the consumer to understand it? What's the state of things with that? Obviously, you're going up against the Purdue's of the world who have mass market control, but what is it like on the ground for small and local farms?
Well, I'll credit Nellie with several good things. One in particular is seeking out a certification for the farm of animal welfare approved, which is a certification that's provided by A Greener World. And A Greener World, you don't see A Greener World certification in many stores because it is by far the highest standard in animal welfare and transparency. So a lot of farms just can't meet the standards. But they have they prepared like this 10-page PDF of all these food labels out there. And what do they mean? And what are they trying to imply? But maybe they don't really mean that. To answer your question, we need help as farmers by organizations like that are willing, like that have they've got the inertia behind them to help educate the consumer in a way that is, just really getting the truth out there. So if someone does really want to spend the time to know what all these labels mean, they can. I will say that the Times a couple of years ago did an article. They went into all of the common animal welfare approved labels, and they said, what does this really mean? And some of them are surprising, like animal welfare approved or certified humane pork. The pig is allowed the size of a baby's crib for its space to live its entire life. And you think that's really certified humane? But I guess that's more space than what if it wasn't certified. There are resources out there. And I think that's been super helpful for us to just see like what we're comparing ourselves to when we look at when we had pigs, and you look at the industry standard for humane is something like 1,000 square feet per pig, and I think we had 15 pigs on 5 acres of ground, and that was the right amount. But as a farmer, if the animal's getting its best treatment.
Yeah, the lobbying is obviously being done to the FDA and these other organizations by massive institutions and massive corporations, and it's a fight that's, I'm sure, very challenging. I think about when the USDA issued the food pyramid guidelines, and when when Michelle Obama, to her credit, was trying to get healthier lunches in schools, and this whole discussion about, I think it was if it was My Plate or whatever the term was, where the lobbying eventually got pizza classified as a vegetable because there was something to do with the cheese. And so it's challenging, and the language is not precise and it's ambiguous, probably intentionally, on the legal side. And so I think the answer probably is to know your farmer that you're buying your food from, but that's easier said than done. And I've heard you talk before about, and I've heard the question asked, it's easy for me, who knows a farmer personally and who can go to a farmer's market, but how do we get people who don't have the access to this type of food? How do we educate them? And I don't know if there's an answer to that, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on it.
I think there's work that's being done in that regard. It's tough in general, people don't have access to healthy food because they don't have the money for it. Like that's really like the access restriction is money. And I think it's beyond the scope of a farmer's responsibility to solve that problem. But I think, culturally, we do have a problem with just being accustomed to things being cheap, particularly food. We're all accustomed to not paying the true cost of food. And when you buy something from us, I have confidence that we've calculated everything into the price of the food, including the environment and the health of the people working with the animals, and even the people at the slaughter facility. I mean, for us, getting animals processed is expensive because we don't go to the Tyson plant, that processes 2,000 animals a day. We go to Locust Grove Smokehouse in Argyle, and they might process 20 a week. But for us, it's worth it. I think about that a lot. Like, how do we get our stuff in everybody's grocery cart? And it's kind of a Sisyphean effort because it's just, there's the new iPhone that came out, and there's all this stuff that we're competing against for the dollars. And ultimately, it comes down to the choice of the consumer.
We have this conversation with folks all the time. We're trying to tell people convince them of the importance of putting an estate plan together when they have children, but it's priorities. And it's
like, I've talked about this recently about vanity. There's a vanity problem, and a will, right? A will doesn't really do much for your, you can't post about that on TikTok.
No, you can't. But it will buy you more peace of mind, as will probably eating a high quality meal than, posting a picture. I'll save that rant for another day. I mean, I think when it comes to this, you said it best in one of your newsletters, which was essentially you said, look, I'm somebody who's going to go and have a burger at, a local brewery or have a burrito or carnitas at Chipotle because they're good. But when I do it, I'm going to be conscious of it, and I'm going to understand I'm making the decision. And I'm understanding what that means. And I think that's probably the best you can hope for anyone who has the option is to be somewhat conscious of the decisions they're making on it.
We're fortunate now because we have that option with food. Yeah. That is, when I talk about like the iPhone, you can't buy an iPhone that was made ethically.
No.
You can't do it. And you can't buy one that was made in the United States. It's impossible. So in a way, I feel like, all right, we're just going to yield to the technology and we're going to support Apple and Dell and all these companies because, there's no other options. But at least with food, we still have that option. We still do have the option.
Yeah, you look, that's probably a point for, a much longer discussion, which is everything's a trade-off. And I may buy, beef from you knowing that it's ethically raised and it's the animals are treated humanely but at the same time, it's like you said, I own stock or I own products from companies that have unbelievably terrible labor practices. And
yeah,
I don't know that, anyone is living perfectly in that regard, but
it's a nuanced world. I mean, it really, it's very nuanced.
And I suppose that's where maybe that's where the language issue comes in. Maybe it's all just nuance and,
right. But your job is to make it not, right? Your job.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, you mentioned something before though, which brought up an interesting topic, I think, which is the ability of these large farms to mass produce product. And my understanding from having heard you talk about this before is that COVID has sort of changed the landscape, at least temporarily, a little bit, because a lot of these big production facilities were forced to shut down. And I remember back in the summertime, I think, or the spring, you'd go to the grocery store and there was no meat. There was like, among other things. I mean, you couldn't get 409 for like a year. But how did that impact you and your facilities and your staff and your business?
It was a shot in the arm for us, surprisingly. We were worried at first, but with the meat processing plant shutdowns, and it wasn't the grocery stores didn't have meat in them, not because there wasn't meat available. It was because there weren't processing plants to take the live animals and turn them into steaks and burgers and things like that. So with those shutdowns, that drove a lot of traffic to us. And we were fortunately able to pick up a bunch of new customers, which was fantastic. Nellie was going to a couple of different farmers markets at the time. And we realized we didn't know what's going to go on with this pandemic. They're saying 10% of the population is going to die. We don't want to go to have you standing at a farmer's market. And plus the farmer's market shut down. So she quickly set up a website with a shopping cart feature. So we were able to start, shipping locally and doing local deliveries. And it's been a great shift for the business. So there's that, silver lining on the COVID story for us. The bigger farms, they definitely got beat up. They were just a victim of this system that required people to be in the plants.
Do you think that this represents a longer term shift in the way people are buying their food, or do you think it's a blip on the radar and that as soon as the bigger mass produced stuff gets produced again and gets more widely available, which it is again now, do you think people will default back to that?
I think it's a little of both. I mean, I would say we kept half the customers that we picked up, which is fantastic. Our job as farmers and retailers of meat is to just keep reminding them of why we're different and that we appreciate them as customers, and for them to tell their friends and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, like you said, the stores are back full of meat. I think chest freezers and stuff like that are back in stock at the hardware store. So, some people shifted how they buy and keep food, but most people, we just regress back to the norm, right?
Yeah, we do. For better or worse. In our world, a lot of times you kind of see big companies using their resources and their power and their legal strength to trump out small competition. Do you see any of that in your business, or do the big farms for the most part leave you guys alone? What's the state of affairs there?
They don't pay much attention to us.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I don't think we're like a threat in any way. It's interesting. We just had a little side story here. There's a local like farm supply store that we buy stuff from, feed and farm, tools and parts and stuff. And it's been in the same family's ownership for like 100 years or something like that. And it was just sold like last week. So the new owner called me and just said, hey, I hope we can keep doing business together. And we're a small account for this place. But I told him, I said, we need you to stay in business for us to stay in business. If you go out of business, we're in trouble. So in a way, having the big farms around us is important because those big farms support those operations. So we can get, we can get the supplies that we need to run our operation without having to shop on Amazon for everything or stuff like that. Silver lining story. There's a few people that do what we do, and you probably know of White Oak Pastures down in Bluffton, Georgia. Will Harris, the owner of that farm, is just a phenomenal businessman, to the point where he's in a very rural area down there, and he's grown his farm doing these regenerative practices. He's built his own slaughterhouse on his farm. He's bought up 15 or 20 of the houses in the town to put employees into. He's actually starting to turn this town into a place where people want to live again. So it's cool to see that. I'm glad we're not starting this 25 years ago when no one was doing it and no one knew how to do it. At least we can learn from some of these people that have been doing it for a little while.
Yeah, it's great to hear that kind of stuff. And I've heard you talking before about this concept of farm to table restaurants eating, and really it sounds like that is sort of the beginning of the true farm to table, which is you have everything in one place, right? And there are a couple of restaurants in the country that are doing that, but other than that, you don't really know. Farm to table is another one of those ambiguous terms, right?
It sure is. Yeah, we would love to have a little restaurant right here on the farm, and we've talked about it before. That like, how would we do it, and how would we start it, and who the hell has time to do it? But it would be that's the dream, right? Is to have to raise. That's the true farm to table. Is to have everything raised right on the property where the restaurant is, because most farm to table is just they most of the stuff's off the Cisco truck, but they get a dozen eggs from someone's kid in 4-H, and they.
Well, and it's a hard term, because I suppose if you're eating a vegetable or an animal, it was at some point raised on some sort of a farm, right?
We're all farms, yeah.
Into your table, so it's a challenging thing. It's marketing more than anything, I'm sure, but. Yeah. We'll start wrapping up here, but what are some, if you had to pinpoint one or two issues facing small farms today, what are they? What are the things that make you think, make you worried about future generations of small farms? And what are the things you're optimistic about?
Land cost is tough. Getting into farming and or even just being a farmer and needing to expand a little bit, purchasing land is just not only is expensive, but it's also it's almost impossible to find. Most farmland sales they don't hit the real estate market. They get sold word of mouth to another farmer. And so getting land is probably the biggest challenge. Equal to that then is paying the taxes on that land. And in New York State, the taxes are pretty high. There are some breaks for farmers, but it's not that significant. And then getting a labor force, finding people who want to work. I mean, I feel like we have a fantastic place to work right here, but it's hard work. We're moving, and that's how things have to operate in a system like we have. The other thing is access to equipment. I think there's potential for farms to work together to share equipment and work together to use that equipment. And that's how the sort of labor and the equipment problem solve themselves.
Collaboration sounds like a good plan to kind of get
ride shares. Yeah. Tractor ride shares.
Yeah. And I'm sure, and look, to some degree, technology will make that easier as time goes on, I would imagine.
It sure will.
To the extent that the industry is willing to move in that direction. And I'm sure there's resistance like there is in any other industry. But
just one last point, but there is an industry movement, and I would like everybody to be aware of this. And I believe you can even around here, we would, and I've done it, written a letter to our representative, Ms. Stefanik, about the USDA is 100% okay with grass-fed beef being imported from another country and being stamped as product of USA. And we would like that. We would really like for that to stop. That would be something that it would be nice if people would make more noise about. That if they're buying grass-fed beef in a grocery store and it says it's from the United States, that it was at least from the United States. I don't think that's too much to ask.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because it brings it full circle to the beginning of the conversation about language being potentially misleading. And I've heard you talk about that before. I was completely unaware of that as a possibility. And to be honest, I don't even know where I would find that if you hadn't mentioned it. So I think that's a good place for people to think about and be aware of. Before we wrap here, where can people find you and your farm and see all kinds of pictures of Nellie and the kids doing the good work? For everyone listening, Eric and Slate River's Instagram account is very picturesque. So
thank you. That's where you can find us on Instagram. We have a presence there. We have our website, slateriverfarmsny.com, and or you can just Google Slate River Farms and it'll take you there. And we have our online store there. And for Saratoga Springs residents, we do deliveries every Monday. Nellie has a route, and I believe right now she is taking on new egg customers. Our eggs are always in high demand, and we're at a point now where she thinks she can take on a few more egg customers for weekly delivery. I know, Scott, you've been a long time weekly egg customer, so every week the eggs just show up at your doorstep.
Yeah, and a plug to Slate River. My daughter Lila is a very, very picky eater, and up until about 2 months ago would rarely eat anything for breakfast, and has somehow at some point decided that she loves a Slate River Farm egg. And so every morning I make her a fried egg, and I make our bulldog Walter a fried egg, and then I make an omelet. So we're really burning through the Slate River Farms.
That's great. Keep it up. Yeah, you should get more dogs.
And are you guys still at farmers markets, or is that?
We are not at any farmers market. So yeah, we do the. People can come to the farm to pick up if you want to see the farm. You can do that. And then for folks that are outside of the sort of local delivery route, we do FedEx shipping on basically anywhere in New York State and New England down to South Jersey. It's a pretty big area that we do one-day shipping to. So.
That's great. I can't recommend your stuff enough, Eric. Thanks so much for coming on. This has been very educational, and
this has been great. I'm glad you guys are doing this podcast. It's I listened to the first one today that you and Giovanna recorded, and it was great. I look forward to more.
Excellent. Thanks.